Hello everyone, this is Pooja Ram Rohit, lecturer, Department of Biology, ASC Independent PU College. In the last session, we discussed about the components of ecosystem. Components of ecosystem includes biotic and abiotic components. Biotic components are all the living organisms of a given ecosystem. Abiotic components include all the non-living components of an ecosystem. Biotic components include producers, consumers, and decomposers. Producers are those organisms who are capable of preparing their own food. Under producers, we've learnt about photoautotrophs and chemoautotrophs. Consumers are those organisms who feed on producers. Now, consumers are basically being classified into macro and micro consumers. Macro consumer is further being classified into primary consumers and secondary consumers. Primary consumers are those organisms which feed on plants or producers directly. Hence, they are also called herbivores. Secondary consumers actually feed on primary consumers to obtain their food. So they're also called carnivores or flesh-eating animals. Decomposers are those organisms which are basically feeding on dead and decaying matter. So we have decomposers and scavengers under micro consumers. This is about the biotic component. Abiotic components of an ecosystem include inorganic substances, organic substances, and atmospheric factors. In this session, I have made an attempt of taking up an example of pond ecosystem and understand the biotic and abiotic components of a pond ecosystem and recollect what we have learnt in the last two sessions so that you will have a foolproof idea of what we are understanding with respect to ecosystem. This will really help us in understanding the topics that will be dealt in this chapter in future classes. So let's start with pond ecosystem. So let's recall what we have learnt in the last few sessions. The term ecosystem explains us that there is a constant interaction between living components and non-living components. Here we are referring with respect to an example that we have taken, that is pond ecosystem. So we will learn in this session about the biotic components present in pond and the abiotic components in pond and what kind of interaction we see among themselves as well as between them. Types of ecosystem, we have natural and artificial. Pond ecosystem is I am taking it as a natural ecosystem. You can also create an artificial pond, then it becomes an artificial ecosystem. Here let's stick on to natural ecosystem. Now under natural we have terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem. So which type of ecosystem is pond ecosystem? It is an aquatic ecosystem. What are the components of ecosystem? Components of ecosystem include biotic component and abiotic components. Okay, so biotic components will have what kind of components? Living organisms. Abiotic components include all the non-living components. So here I have represented the picture of a pond ecosystem, which helps us in understanding what are the abiotic factors that we have and what are the biotic factors that we have within a pond. You can see certain protozoans, bacteria, planktons, and certain plants which make up the biotic components here. And you also see water, the soil, and sunlight, and other non-living components which make up the abiotic component. Students, as we have discussed earlier, biotic components include producers, consumers, and decomposers. So with respect to pond ecosystem, we shall learn which are those organisms that come under producers, further in consumers, and which are those organisms that basically act as decomposers. So in the future slides, we will take up individually about producers of a pond ecosystem, consumers of pond ecosystem, and similarly the decomposers of pond ecosystem. Pond is a shallow, simple, self-sustainable water body that exhibits all the basic components of an ecosystem. It includes biotic as well as abiotic components. Under biotic components, we have the producers, which are autotrophic in nature. In this slide, I have depicted the pictures of phytoplankton, some algae, certain floating and submerged plants. These are the main producers that we find in pond ecosystem. They are all phototrophic in nature, so they are capable of preparing their own food by trapping solar energy and converting it into chemical energy. So photosynthesis is carried out by these producers and they convert the inorganic material into organic matter. Phytoplanktons include diatoms, dinoflagellates, and different forms of different tiny single-celled algal forms. In the second picture, you can see algal bloom in a pond, which is dreadful, which causes eutrophication, of course, but algal forms are one of the major producers in the pond ecosystem. Followed by that, we have different types of aquatic plants. Some are floating, some are submerged, and some are just marginal plants as well. So all these are some of the examples of phototrophic components or biotic components found in pond ecosystem. Consumers are those organisms which feed on producers in order to obtain food. They're all herbivorous in nature. So the primary consumers in a pond ecosystem consists of tiny herbivorous animals that feed on algae and other aquatic plants in order to sustain themselves. These animals include insects, tadpoles, very small fish, and snails. They also include a variety of nearly microscopic animals collectively known as zooplanktons. In this slide, I have depicted few pictures of primary consumers found in pond ecosystem. Here we see tiny microscopic animals such as zooplanktons, which basically feed on phytoplanktons. We see small crayfishes, insects who again depend on the plant material for their food, snails, and tiny tadpoles, which basically feed on producers again. So this depicts the primary consumers of the pond ecosystem. The next strand in the pond ecosystem is the secondary consumers. They eat the primary consumers. The second level of animal consumers includes many species of fish, frogs, and other amphibians. Crayfishes and reptiles such as turtles and water snakes are also some of the secondary consumers found in pond ecosystem. In this slide, I have depicted the pictures of secondary consumers who all feed on herbivorous animals. The pond ecosystem also includes the tertiary consumers, which eat the animals of the primary and the secondary levels. That is, they are feeding on primary and the secondary consumers. The third level of animal consumer in pond ecosystem includes fish and frog eating water birds, fish eating hogs, numerous small mammals, and human beings. So overall, consumers are heterotrophic in nature, and consumers in food in pond ecosystem includes zooplanktons, free swimming, and bottom dwelling aquatic animals. Several bacterial forms and fungal forms and animal scavengers break down the dead and decaying aquatic plants and animals, releasing their elemental nutrients. The recycling of nutrients by decomposers make the nutrients available to the generation of plants that are eaten up by tiny animals, which are further eaten up by larger animals, and which are in turn eaten up by the largest animals. So, as the breakdown of dead and decaying matter of any plant and animal in the pond ecosystem is carried out, it releases all the inorganic nutrients into the soil. These nutrients are further taken up by the green plants and they carry out photosynthesis and produce organic matter. These producers are eaten up by the primary consumers. So, there is transfer of energy from producers into the primary consumers. Primary consumers are then fed by the secondary consumers. So the energy flow is now from the primary to the secondary consumers. Secondary consumers are further eaten up by the tertiary consumers. So again we see an energy flow from secondary consumer into the tertiary consumers. In this slide I have depicted the pictures of different fungal forms. I have taken only fungal forms here, where here various bacterial forms are also involved in decomposition. Here you can see the picture of alternarial species, Fusarium, Rhizopus and Mucor, which basically are all the fungal forms which are mainly involved in decomposition. This particular picture represents the energy flow within different levels of biotic components seen in pond ecosystem. Producers are fed by primary consumers. Primary consumers are fed by secondary consumers, and the secondary consumers are fed by tertiary consumers. In case of pond ecosystem, major producers are the phytoplanktons. Phytoplanktons are eaten up by zooplanktons, which are the primary consumers in pond ecosystem. These zooplanktons are eaten up by invertebrates. Invertebrates such as we discussed about snails and other components. Yes, snails, frogs, snakes, etc. And then these are eaten up by the tertiary consumers. You can consider them as the large invertebrates or the vertebrates themselves. Yes, so this is how there is constant energy flow and constant interaction between biotic components itself. So if you recall what we have learned, I told you that ecosystem is an interaction between biotic and abiotic components, and also an interaction within the biotic components. So here we see there is interaction between biotic components themselves. As we all know, abiotic components of an ecosystem includes inorganic substances, organic substances and atmospheric factors. So when it comes to atmospheric factors or the environmental factors, we have light, water, temperature, etc. When it comes to inorganic components, we have oxygen, carbon dioxide and nitrogen. And organic substances include carbohydrate, proteins and fats. With respect to pond ecosystem, we have sunlight, which basically provides us that light energy, which is an ultimate source of energy in an ecosystem. Air contains gaseous substances such as carbon dioxide and nitrogen dioxide. Then we have oxygen that is available from water. The dissolved oxygen in water is taken for respiration by the aquatic animals present in the pond. We also have certain nutrients like the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, etc., which are found in the soil. So plants readily take up these nutrients from the soil. So we see there is a constant interaction between living and non-living organisms. If I have to recall with respect to pond ecosystem, soil is providing us all the basic inorganic nutrients, correct? And the plants, producers, are taking up nutrients from soil and is trapping the solar energy. Around out of 100%, only 1% will be trapped by the producers. Rest, it is just absorbed, it is just taken inside but never absorbed into the producers. That you need to keep in mind. So light energy will be converted into chemical energy in the producers. So producers are directly dependent on the abiotic factors. correct? Now these producers are eaten up by the consumers. So the food is readily available from the producers, which actually directly were dependent on abiotic factors. So animals who are feeding on plants, that is, we use the term as primary consumers, they are indirectly dependent on environmental factors or the abiotic components, right? Now even the dissolved oxygen present in water, that will be taken up by the primary consumers, secondary consumers, or overall, if I have to say, since it's pond ecosystem, the aquatic animals. So there also we see an interaction between animals and the abiotic factor. So this way, in pond ecosystem, we see interaction between the biotic components and also among the biotic component and between the biotic and abiotic components. So students, with this we understand pond performs all the function of an ecosystem. The functions include conversion of inorganic material to organic material using light energy by autotrophs, that is producers. Then consumption of autotrophs by heterotrophs, that is consumers. And finally, decomposition and mineralization of the dead matter to release them back for reuse by autotrophs. So here I have a set of assignment questions that you need to complete. You can send your answers through mail. My email ID was given to you in the last session, and also the notes for session 1 and session 2 is being provided. In the future classes, as and when I take up the topics, accordingly I'll be sending you the notes, so you'll be able to answer the questions that are asked. These questions include some of the important questions that were asked in previous boards, and some of the questions are slightly tricky, just to understand whether you have followed what has been dealt in the last few sessions. So students, keep learning and stay safe.